Hi everyone, Mrs. Rinker here. So today we are bringing to a close our look at World War II. And to do that, we're focusing in on the end of the war. So last week we looked at victory in Europe with the surrender of Germany, which came in May of 1945. This week we're looking at victory in Japan, which did not come until September of 1945. And really what we're going to focus in on is what tends to get most of the credit for that surrender, which is the use of atomic weapons, the first and only time that atomic weapons have ever been used in a time of war against people. All right. But before we do that, I want to look at some of the other impacts that World War II had on the New World Order. Now, one of those that's important to note is that we see a dramatic shift in power. Prior to World War II, really prior to World War I, the dominant nations in the world had been European, Britain, Belgium, France, Germany, those countries that had industrialized first. Now, after World War II, Europe is in shambles, right? After having suffered through not one, but two global conflicts now. So who comes out as the most powerful are the US and the USSR, both politically and militarily. And this is really part of what leads us into the Cold War. It's these two dominant nations trying to figure out who is going to have the dominant political philosophy and the most influence in the world. Wish we had time for that, but we don't. Now, another important impact on, or that came out of World War II, rather, is that imperialism starts to decline. We see nations all across Africa and Southeast Asia gaining independence very quickly within a span of about 10 to 20 years. Now, there's two reasons for this. One is that Europe is in shambles, and let's face it, maintaining an empire is expensive. They can't afford it anymore. So when these nations start to ask for independence, they say, go for it. We can't manage you anymore. Now, there's also another part to this, and that's that the Axis powers really made imperialism look pretty ugly during World War II. We have Japan with its brutal and horrific invasion of China in 1937. And then, of course, Germany that dominated most of Europe and in the process implemented their Nazi program and thus the Holocaust. So altogether, imperialism is kind of out of favor, too expensive, and thus we see lots of nations becoming independent. Another important impact that's coming out of World War II is that we start to see a higher degree of international cooperations. We have the development of the United Nations, which essentially looks very much like the League of Nations that Wilson had been asking for way back in after World War I. The only major difference being that after World War II, we see the implementation of what's called the Security Council in this new organization. And that's made up of the former allies, US, France, Great Britain, Russia, and China. And they do have some veto power, similar to what a president has in terms of what gets passed through the United Nations. So a couple other important organizations to note would be the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And both those organizations are meant to help stabilize the world economy, giving out loans to developing nations or after World War II nations that were trying to rebuild, stabilizing currency, things like that. And the U.S. was probably the biggest funder for both those organizations, as well as playing a large role in the leadership in those organizations. So that brings me to my next point, which is that the U.S. really becomes a global leader, a nation that others are looking to kind of help them out, as well as to help protect the fundamental parts to democracy. And with this, the U.S. really now is firmly cemented in that idea that isolation isn't an option, right? We can't just close our eyes to what's happening in the world because other nations are looking to us. And when we tried that, look, it didn't work out so well, right? We tried to stay out of things in World War I, tried to stay out of things in World War II, and it just ended up getting more messy. So better to, have a hand in the game in the first place. Now, the last point that I want to come to here is the development of atomic weapons, which not only had a major impact on the end of the war, but also on global politics thereon after. big part of the Cold War was a fear that the US and the USSR would use these weapons against each other. Now, the Cold War has ended, but that fear hasn't disappeared completely, right? It was just about a year and a half ago, we were on the brink of something between North Korea, right? The potential for North Korea to launch an intercontinental ballistic nuclear weapon towards the US. And now we have, again, Iran that is talking about developing their nuclear program further again. So atomic weapons not only change things in the short term for the world as far as the Cold War, but absolutely in the long term as well, because this is still a part of the dynamic to war and politics today. So how did we get this technology? Well, let us talk about that. So in the 1930s, scientists have discovered that splitting an atom releases a lot of energy. And this is kind of the basic principle behind any atomic weapon. You can use lots of different elements, but basically that's what you're doing. Now, Einstein, you all know Einstein, that very prominent physicist, mathematician, super smart guy. He wrote a letter to FDR in the 1930s warning him that the Nazis were actually pursuing this technology to make a bomb, and that if the US didn't get on it and make one of their own, this could be disastrous, right? The world would be dominated by the Nazis. So FDR heeded this warning, and in 1942, he made the development of atomic weaponry a high priority. And this created what's called the Manhattan Project. Named so because initially it was set up in Manhattan, but very quickly they realized that's a bad idea. There are lots of people there, and ended up moving out to New Mexico, a much more sparsely populated state. Now, put in charge of the operation on the military side was General Leslie Groves. He was really in charge of security, staffing, getting proper facilities. And on the science side was physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. And he was really focused on managing the other scientists involved, the ultimate engineering of the project. So the most important atomic development program was in Los Alamos, New Mexico. There are others, but that was the most important one. And at Los Alamos, security was extremely tight, not only getting in and out of the facilities, but actually on working on the different pieces of the projects themselves. Very few people were privy to the plans for the entire bomb. And there's a reason for this, right? If I only know how to make the fins, then I run off to Russia. I can't tell them how to make a whole bomb. I can only tell them how to make the fins. So it was actually a very clever security protocol. Now, it took a while, right? But finally, in July of 1945, they were ready to test a bomb. Now, let's take a moment before we talk about the actual testing to think about that date. By July, Europe had already surrendered. So our only opponent in this war was Japan. And the fighting in Japan had gotten bad. There is a high degree of kamikaze pilots, right? Those Japanese pilots essentially committing suicide by crashing into other planes, aircraft carriers, whatever they could do to create damage. And the fighting itself, the battles were just getting longer and longer, such as the Battle of Okinawa or Iwo Jima, more and more casualties during these conflicts with Japan. So it's not like things were getting any easier. And certainly from the government's perspective, it didn't look like the war was going to end anytime soon. So all of that is in the backdrop when on July of 1945, the US successfully detonates the first atomic bomb. So this happened in Alamogordo, New Mexico. You can actually go visit that site. It's a national park, but it's only open twice a year. So the scientists didn't know exactly what to expect when they actually detonated the bomb, and many of them were blown away at just how powerful it was. The light was visible from 180 miles away. That's like to Boston and back, right? Sound was heard 100 miles away. So you can imagine even the surrounding towns, had some sort of inkling that something was going on because they could see it or potentially even hear it. All right, now remember again, security was very tight on this project. So Truman, who is now president, had only gained knowledge of the Manhattan Project upon FDR's death. Okay, so just a few months after, right? FDR died in April. Now we're in July. We've successfully tested a bomb, and the war is still going in Japan. So where does that leave Truman? He has to decide whether or not we use it, right? Should we use this this horrifically effective bomb to try to bring the war to an end? So Truman really had to rely heavily on his military advisors because he didn't really have the backstory of the development of the weapon itself. Also, he had only been president for a few months. So while he did know what had been happening in the war, he wasn't really in charge of anything while all of this was going on. FDR had been making all of those final decisions. So his advisors come to him and they say, all right, look, Truman, you want the war to end, okay? If we invade Japan, and that's the only way to finally bring this to an end, if we're not going to use these bombs, we could lose up to 1 million US soldiers. Worst case scenario. Best case scenario, 500,000 soldiers. Now, modern estimates say that was probably a little exaggerated, that more likely it would have been around 193,000 casualties. But those were the figures that Truman was given at the time. So with that information, with the fact that the fighting was only getting worse for the battles that the U.S. was able to undertake and eventually become victorious in, casualty numbers were getting worse, he decides, yes, okay, this is our best option. We may kill a lot of Japanese people, but we will not lose 500,000 to 1 million U.S. soldiers. So the decision is made, and on August 6, 1945, led on a plane nicknamed the Enola Gay, the crew drops the atomic bomb, the very first atomic bomb on Hiroshima at 9:14 in the morning. Within 2 minutes, 60,000 people were dead or missing, some incinerated. Their bodies, the only evidence left of them is shadows burned into walls. Some of them so badly burned that they, you couldn't determine facial features. Some crushed by fallen buildings. There are numerous different ways that people came to their demise. And by December, that number grew to 90,000 to 120,000 dead due to radiation sickness. So with the dropping of the bomb, Japan again is asked to surrender, and they start to debate. They're not sure. Remember, part of the conditions of surrender is that their emperor has to withdraw. And the emperor in Japan at this time was also a quasi-religious figure. So this was kind of a difficult decision for Japan, a little more so than perhaps other nations. Now, on August 9th, two important things happen on the same day. One, the Soviets, who had previous to this been in a non-aggression pact with Japan, so they were not fighting with Japan, actually invade Manchuria. So they go ahead and act aggressively towards Japan, trying to bring the war to the close. The very same day, the U.S. drops a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing 35,000 within the first 2 minutes. And again, by December, that number rises to 60 to 80,000 who are dead. After this, Japan very quickly is coming into talks with the U.S. and the USSR now, who is also their enemy. Prior to this, they had not been, that they are in talks of how to negotiate a surrender. The agreement doesn't come until several days later, August 15th, and the official surrender is signed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri. So now the war is officially over. But the question remains, was that necessarily the right decision? Did we have to drop this horrendous weapon, not once but twice, on Japan in order to bring the war to a close? Now, this is something that historians still argue about, right? Was that the right decision or not? historians and political figures as well. And that's the question that I want you all to dig into for our final project for this unit. Now, some things to think about before you try to answer this question. And I will put these in your actual assignment as well, which is titled To Bomb or Not to Bomb. So the question, was the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki the right decision? So some things to think about. What were some of the impacts to the war itself? Do you think it was actually necessary to end the war? And perhaps more importantly, do you believe it saved lives as Truman had hoped it would? Now, another thing I want you to think about, some of the long-term impacts of introducing this technology. What have we learned from the bombings about radiation? What were some of the long-term impacts on the Japanese people? What were some of the long-term impacts on weapons development and political instability? And what were some of the long-term impacts on global politics? Do the bombs help keep the peace in the world, or do they just create more tension? So I want you to try to think about several of those elements as you answer this question. But you are not alone in doing so, okay? I have lots of resources that I want you to look at. And again, this is all attached into the actual assignment, but I'll go over them quickly just to make sure that everybody understands what to do. All right, so the first step in trying to answer this question is I want you to have a better understanding of the issues and impacts around that decision. So I have 3 different videos that I want you to watch, and I do want you to watch them in order. The first one is just a short little piece put together by the Washington Post about the controversy over the decision to drop the bomb. And how people are still debating that today. The second one is looking at some of the more long-term health impacts, i.e. radiation. And the last one shows the evolution of nuclear weapons, especially during, the most intense days of the Cold War. So like the 1950s to like the 1960s, 70s. And then last, I want you to read some primary source and secondary source documents that are attached to the assignment. And that document is titled Bombing Debate Documents. Okay. Now, after you've looked at all of those resources to help you better understand some of the issues and impacts around the use of the bomb, then I want you to go ahead and try to tackle the question. So use those resources, use anything that I've posted in this lecture. Use anything that we've talked about prior to this lecture to help you write your answer. And I have all the requirements listed in the assignment. No outside research is required, okay? This is not a Google the answer assignment. But for those of you that would like a couple more facts to kind of back up your answers, if you do use an outside source, you have to provide a citation. Okay, so you have to actually give credit to whoever or wherever you found that from. And your answer must include some details from at least 2 of the sources above. Okay, so I'm not just having you watch those for nothing. I do want you to actually use those in forming your answer. Okay, now I'll say this one last thing before I bring to a close. There is not a right or wrong answer here. Okay, this is a question that many, many people still debate and have not quite come to terms with, where they lie on this issue. Okay, so no right or wrong issue as long as you back it up, no right or wrong answer as long as you back it up with good, solid facts. All right, so that should be plenty to get you off on your way on your final assignment, your final project for World War II and for the year. I'll just say one last thing. It's really been a great year. I am sad that we had to end this way, but it's been wonderful working with you all this year, and I really will miss you. Please come back and visit next year. My door is always open, and have a great summer. All right, bye everyone.